Hello. In this learning module, we'll introduce the key messages from the 2025 Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey. My name is Katie Momber, Senior Programme Manager at the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, or ICSI, and I'll begin with an overview of the survey, its purpose, scope, and approach. I will then hand over to Savina Carluccio, Executive Director of ICSI, who will present the survey's key findings and draw out the main messages, highlighting what they mean for strengthening infrastructure resilience in practice. As infrastructure systems face escalating risks from disasters and climate change, there's an urgent need to understand how they can better withstand shocks, adapt to emerging risks, and recover quickly. To address this, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, or CDRI, appointed ICSI as the lead technical partner to deliver the Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey. They examined 6 core themes: governance and institutions, finance, risk assessments, nature-based solutions, advanced technologies, and monitoring systems. Drawing on the perspectives of infrastructure professionals, including engineers, planners, policymakers, and private sector actors across regions and countries, the survey provides a unique global picture of the strengths, deficiencies, and opportunities for building resilience. It offers an integrated assessment of national infrastructure systems, revealing critical gaps between resilience policies and their real-world application. Rather than reflecting a theoretical framework, the evidence base captures operational realities and the challenges that practitioners face in strengthening infrastructure resilience in diverse contexts. This slide outlines the intended learning outcomes for this module. By the end of the session, you should have a clear understanding of the aim and scope of the Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey, as well as the ability to interpret its findings. You will also be equipped to identify the key themes emerging from the survey, particularly in relation to governance, funding, and capacity constraints. In addition, the module will support you in recognizing how resilience practices are currently being applied and understanding the main barriers that continue to limit progress. And finally, you'll be encouraged to reflect on what these findings indicate about current limitations, how practitioner perspectives can inform future efforts to strengthen infrastructure resilience. We'll begin the presentation with a brief introduction to the Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey, including its objectives and overall scope. The main focus of the session will then be a detailed examination of the key messages emerging from the survey. These findings highlight several critical issues. In particular, they emphasize the importance of stronger policies, standards, and enforcement as central government actions to improve resilience. They also point to persistent weaknesses in institutional and human capacity, which contribute to constrain progress amongst many contexts. A further key message is that so-called invisible resilience measures, such as maintenance and risk reduction, remain consistently underfunded. The survey also reveals that risk assessments are not applied consistently and are often insufficiently integrated into decision-making processes. Taken together, these challenges contribute to what can be described as an implementation ceiling, limiting the effectiveness of efforts related to retrofitting risk tools and the adoption of advanced technologies. In addition, gaps in professional capacity are identified as a significant barrier to scaling solutions. Addressing these gaps through professional development and educational reform is therefore highlighted as a critical priority. The following were the key objectives of the study. So first, to create awareness on the resilience of global infrastructure systems. We wanted to assess the capacity of infrastructure systems globally to absorb, respond, recover from the repercussions of disasters, based on the perspective of professionals working in the infrastructure sectors. It also aimed to generate insights into infrastructure resilience across regions, countries, and institutional structures. Secondly, the survey aimed to understand institutional, technical, and human capacities better. It collected and analysed data on institutional governance and human capacities in infrastructure across different nations to comprehend the systemic differences in management and how these could be addressed. It also needed to gather broader perspectives and compile diverse viewpoints through a multilingual online questionnaire, through expert interviews and focus group discussions to create an integrated picture of national infrastructure systems from the responses of local experts engaged in the design, construction, operations, and repair of infrastructure systems. It needed to highlight the good practices in infrastructure resilience. It also needed to identify areas for improvement. So, using the insights gained from the survey, it needed to make recommendations to help countries identify the institutional, policy, and capacity aspects of infrastructure systems that require improvement to enhance their ability to withstand disasters, adapt to changing risks, and serve communities when they need it most. And finally, the aim of the survey was to support global knowledge sharing and policy development. It needed to build an evidence base to inform CDRI's GIR 2025 report, provide actionable insights for policymakers, practitioners, and researchers to help them align resilience strategies with global frameworks. So, a bit more about the survey before we move on to the key messages. The Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey gathered more than 3,000 responses from over 100 countries. The research was further enriched by more than 70 in-depth interviews and 5 focus group discussions conducted across 47 countries. The survey was implemented by FIDIC as the lead partner, supporting outreach to engineering and infrastructure professions globally. It was also supported by several dissemination partners, such as the Institute of Asset Management, the Engineering Leadership Group, the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, the American Society of Civil Engineers, the European Council of Civil Engineers, Tasks Africa, the Commonwealth Engineers Council, and the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure. They all helped ensure the broad regional representation and engagement across sectors. Respondents' profiles included government officials, engineers and planners, private sector firms, as well as representatives from NGOs, financial institutions, and academia. The survey findings were analysed at multiple levels to capture both global trends and contextual differences. Results were examined by country income level, using World Bank classifications to understand how resilience challenges vary across high, middle, and low income countries. The data was also analysed by region, following the Global Infrastructure Resilience Report regional groupings, to identify geographical patterns and shared regional challenges. The survey covered 6 thematic areas. First was governance and institutions, which examined public and private sector human resources and technical capacities. It looked at the existence and enforcement of regulations, codes, and standards, and coordination mechanisms for disaster risk management. The second theme was finance, which assessed the adequacy of government funding for resilience and explored financial mechanisms such as public-private partnerships, insurance, and thematic bonds. It also looked at risk assessments and evaluated the use of climate and disaster risk assessments, the inclusion of future climate scenarios in infrastructure design, and the availability and accessibility of relevant data. Another theme was advanced technologies, including the use of AI, BIM, digital technologies, and monitoring tools to strengthen resilience, and also nature-based solutions for resilience, which examined their adoption, financing, maintenance arrangements, and the institutional capacity required to implement them effectively. And finally, it looked at the theme of monitoring systems, which considered post-disaster damage assessments and the existence and quality of infrastructure asset registers. Following this introduction, let me now hand over to Savina Carluccio, Executive Director of ICSI, who will present the survey's key messages. Over to you, Savina.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I'm Savina Carluccio, Executive Director at the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, ICSI. Let me just take you through some of the key insights emerging from this study. So if you go to the next slide, When we asked the infrastructure professionals across the world what the government's top priorities for resilience should be, about 50% of respondents globally identified strengthening policies, regulations, codes, and standards for infrastructure resilience as the top priority, as well as their enforcement. Other priorities ranking quite high were disaster preparedness and response planning, and proactive maintenance and repairs, followed closely by financing. We go to the next slide, please. The next key insight is about national regulation codes and standards. So this chart shows the current state of national regulation codes and standards for infrastructure resilience globally. So just about 1/5 of respondents considers that the current regulation codes and standards in their own countries are adequate, while the vast majority doesn't think that the existing ones are adequate to address the resilience and account for future climate risk in infrastructure sectors. Enforcement is another major gap. Around 2/3 of respondents reported that enforcement is lacking in their countries, and it seems to be largely limited to flagship or large-scale projects, rather than applied systematically across all infrastructure. Inspections and compliance mechanisms are also often weak. Next slide, please. Institutional capacity and human resources within government are central challenges. Only 15% globally consider public sector capacity to be adequate, while nearly 40% reported institutional capacity is perceived as limited in their own countries, indicating that government struggle with capacity to implement resilience measures without external support. The chart shows regional variations, so you will see many of these charts in the working paper, so that you can appreciate the regional variation. And in this case, the findings show that even more severe limitations are perceived by professionals in Latin America and in South Asia in terms of capacity of institutions. Human resources availability shows a similar pattern. So, and the study highlighted shortage of skilled professionals, which affects implementation, particularly at the subnational and municipal levels of government. Fragmentation across ministries, staff turnover, weak coordination are also highlighted as key constraints. Next slide, please. There is a systematic underinvestment in what we call the invisible resilience measures. I hope this, the way we call it sticks, because I think it just gives an idea that maintenance, retrofitting, data systems, they are invisible when you compare them to the more visible interventions favored by political leadership, such as capital expenditure on new infrastructure, or also necessary ones when a disaster strikes and then you need to spend on post-disaster reconstruction. So those preventative measures, the retrofitting, the risk-based maintenance, are chronically underfunded. 60% of respondents reported that funding only just meets less than a quarter of identified resilience needs. And this reflects a broader structural challenge. Investments that are visible and politically attractive are prioritized, while long-term risk reduction remains neglected and critical vulnerabilities remain unaddressed. Next slide, please. A core foundation of resilient infrastructure is the consistent application of climate and disaster risk assessments in planning and design. However, our global study shows that risk assessments are often inconsistently and poorly applied. Only 1/4 of respondents reported consistent use. And this drops even further when it comes to the integration of future climate scenarios in risk assessments. This indicates that many infrastructure decisions continue to rely primarily on historical data rather than forward-looking climate projections. So while comprehensive data sets are rare, data actually often exist. However, it is frequently trapped in institutional silos, it suffers from poor quality or incompatible formats and other constraints. So the challenge is not simply generating more data, but improving data governance, accessibility, and integration into infrastructure decision-making. Next, please. So when we looked across, and as I said at the start, we've done a multi-level analysis, and we looked across all the findings, and in all the different areas, we identified a pattern that we described as an implementation ceiling. So across the key areas, including institutional capacity, the retrofitting program, the risk assessment, adoption of nature-based solutions to enhance resilience, and the adoption of advanced technologies for the same to enhance resilience, only just a small minority of respondents, around 50%, that is our implementation ceiling, 15% globally reported systematic and consistent application. So this pattern really shows that these are structural limits that we're dealing with to resilience under the current institutional arrangement. So something really does need to change in a transformative way. Next, please. And that's where we come to capacity, really close to our heart at ICSI, and also close to many of the institutions that are on the call have this as a focus and a priority. So even when policies and technical solutions exist, they cannot scale without sufficient professional capacity. Only about 15% of respondents reported a consistent use of, for example, nature-based solutions, or even less, 12% globally reported consistent uptake of advanced technologies. So while these approaches are widely known and increasingly discussed in many different environments and circles, they remain largely at pilot stage or confined to flagship and donor-driven projects. Barriers include institutional inertia, gaps in professional training, limited practical guidance, and the conservative practices within the engineering profession, planning and finances communities. So without strengthening the professional capacity and updating education and training systems, it will be difficult to move from isolated examples to systematic implementation of resilience measures. Next, please. And so scaling the resilience requires not only policy and funding, but also transformation on professional capacity, as just said. Recurring funding from the study was also the lack of a common language and clear practical guidance on resilience. And this is not just for professional engineers or professionals in the infrastructure sectors. This is for decision makers at all levels that will struggle to translate that ambition, that high-level commitment into concrete and actionable plans. So engineers and practitioners need practical knowledge and skills to apply, interpret, and validate resilience standards and codes in the projects they design and deliver. So strengthening things such as the capability of inspection, monitoring, performance evaluation is also critical, because once the project is in place, then we need to ensure that it meets the resilience standards that have been designed to, and so that they are enforced consistently. But also considering that we are operating in a changing climate, we need to have that sort of adaptability built into projects and designs. At the same time, academia must integrate resilience thinking too into the engineering curriculum, so that the future graduates are equipped to design, operate, and maintain infrastructure that is fit for climate and systemic risks. So bridging capacity gaps therefore requires both upskilling the current workforce and reforming of education systems to prepare the next generation of professionals.
Thank you, Sabina. So as we have seen, the findings from the Global Infrastructure Resilience Survey provide a valuable overview of how resilience is currently understood and applied across different contexts. They highlight both areas of progress and, importantly, distinct gaps that continue to limit implementation. What emerges quite clearly is that strengthening infrastructure resilience is not only a technical challenge, but also an institutional and human one, requiring coordinated action across policy, practice, and education. We hope this module has provided you with a clearer understanding of these challenges, as well as practical insights on how they are experienced by practitioners globally. Most importantly, we encourage you to reflect on how these findings relate to your own context and how they might inform your work going forward. Thank you so much for your time and your engagement. Goodbye.